everyone. Welcome to the webinar on how Christians should respond to the global climate crisis. I think people are still joining us. We're really excited to announce that we've had a lot more people joining than we thought we might have in our first of what might become a series of webinars where we're featuring different people who are talking from a perspective of faith about the global climate crisis and issues around environmentalism and the local environment and how that factors into caring for people globally, especially. So, Saturday was World Environment Day. And it was probably even more interesting, which is the kickoff to the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. That's a lot of words, but it's really exciting for those of us who have been doing this type of work for a long time to get the focus of the global community on ecosystem restoration and the hope and opportunity that that offers to our friends and families and peers globally. According to a Yale University study, 73% of Americans believe that climate change is happening, and the majority of Americans feel that it will have a negative impact on humanity. Yet it's an issue that generally hasn't gotten a lot of the same attention from the church, at least not here in the US. And so we want to know, is this time for that to change? And to dive further into some of those questions and to think about what is our role in this. So thank you for joining us and helping us explore those questions. To lead this conversation, I'd like to welcome and introduce our four panelists. So we've got Sandy Richter here, who is the Robert Gundry Chair of the Biblical Studies at Westmont College. She's the author of Stewards of Eden, which I actually have right here. It's very pretty. Oh, you can't see that. What Scripture Says About the Environment and Why It Matters is the subtitle. Sandy is recognized as an expert on environmental theology. Sorry about the background that blurred out your book cover. I was trying to be helpful there. We also have Rusty Prichard. Rusty is a natural resource economist and the director of VP, Vice President, right? At Tier Funds is your current title. It's an evangelical nonprofit that works alongside local churches all over the world to overcome poverty and injustice. He's worked for over 30 years at the intersection of environment and international economic development, and we're really excited to have you here, Rusty. Thank you. Rachel Lamb is a Maryland Sea Grant State Science Policy Fellow with the Maryland Department of the Environment, the Climate Change Program. She's the founder of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, where she's still a senior advisor and serves as a board member of Arasha, a Christian conservation organization. So thank you, Rachel. And Scott Sabin is my boss, technically, so I'm just going to throw that out there. But Scott is the CEO of Plant with Purpose, a Christian environmental organization that works with vulnerable communities all around the world to reverse poverty and deforestation. He's also the author of Tending to Eden, which I will not attempt to show because I realized it doesn't work. So that is our panel in brief. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you everyone who's joining us in attendance at this as well. I'm really excited to be able to launch this conversation and hopefully launch a series of conversations like this. So I'm just going to dive straight into questions, and how this is going to work is I'll throw a question out there and then I'll throw it to one of the panelists, but the rest of you feel free. If there's something that you really want to chime in and say, go for it, and then I'll probably call out a second person on a lot of these as well. So our first question, from a realistic scientific perspective, what is the current state of our global climate and environment? Are things really as urgent and dire as we often hear in the news? Rachel, would you be willing to take a first stab at that?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me to join the discussion today. Several years ago, the AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, it's a professional organization, they worked with their climate science panel to put out a report. And I think they summarized the takeaway points really well. So I'm going to repeat them here. First, climate change is happening now. It's because of us, and it's serious. But the sooner we act, the lower the risk and the cost. And there's so much that we can do. Climate change is really challenging, in part because it's what we call a threat multiplier. So take all of the major social and environmental issues that we can think about today. So those might include things like biodiversity loss or water insecurity or extreme poverty. Climate change makes those worse. So that means that a lot of the good traditional work that conservation organizations and relief and development organizations have been doing is made more challenging by this reality. And actually so much so that much of our work in these important areas could actually be undone or threatened in the future without intentionally figuring out how to integrate climate change mitigation and resilience building into our efforts now. But the good news is, just like we mentioned at the opening, that ecosystem restoration is actually a really excellent and unique tool for addressing not only climate change, but a lot of these other really important related environmental and social challenges. And of course, it's important to realize it's just one tool in our large toolbox of greenhouse gas reduction action strategies. But not only can our ecosystems, so thinking about natural conservation areas or working lands like agricultural and ranch lands, not only can they help us sequester or remove carbon from the atmosphere, but they're also really good at helping us achieve other benefits, like helping us improve water quality or helping us heal our soils and lands, providing a sustainable source of natural resources for local communities, or even supporting critical habitat for species of concern. Now, it's important to emphasize that it does take a lot of work to pull all of these benefits together in any given location or any given area. And we shouldn't assume that they all will just be there. But the good news is we know enough about the causes and the drivers of these major environmental changes that we can really move forward in now developing win-win effective solutions.
Scott, I'm just thinking particularly about the state, and are things is really urgent and dire, especially from the perspective, or Rusty, from the perspective of the developing world, families who are living in countries that have less resources. Would one of you guys be willing to impromptu speak about that a little bit? I think that would be a helpful thing to add to Rachel's comments.
Rusty, you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that I find really disturbing and perplexing is that as much as we've depended on good science to kind of project what we think changes that we're facing in the future are going to be, for a lot of those variables, in particular, sea level warming, sea level rise, sea warming, and ice sheets collapsing, just to take a few, things are like on the top end of the range of predictions that climate scientists have suggested. And we're seeing all sorts of things that are enveloping us here in the States that are kind of waking us up for the first time, like the fires that you guys have experienced out west, like the hurricanes that we've experienced here in the Southeast. It's just like Rachel said, it's right on our doorstep. It's happening right now. And that's even more true when you visit the developing world and you listen to stories of farmers talk about what it is like to try to grow crops when they don't know when the rainy season starts anymore, when the seed varieties that they planted before aren't working because of the new moisture regime. And that's something that Plant with Purpose does a lot of. So I should kick it over to Scott to talk a little bit more about what people experience about climate change in the developing world.
Yeah, well, that's why I got interested in this topic in the first place, was spending time with farmers. And I was just thinking about one today who was trying to eke out a living on a hillside of rocks, a hillside that you would not even visualize as being a farm. It looked like basically an eroded cliff with no topsoil. And here is this guy trying to plant beans there and realizing how utterly dependent he was, his family was, on the state of his environment. And as Rusty, as you already mentioned, on the predictability of the rain. Is the rain going to come? Have you ever planted a garden? Can you imagine planting a garden and then not watering it? Well, just wait for the next. That's what literally billions of people are forced to do. And when that rain becomes irregular or doesn't come at all, like the unprecedented drought we're experiencing right now in the Southwest, that can be a death sentence. So yeah, that is really serious.
This teases up really well for our next question, which is, What are the implications of these environmental issues for humankind, both now and into the future? Who's being affected? Rachel, would you lead us there again?
Sure. I think we've already touching on some key important themes here. So human health or community health is intricately connected to the health of our environment. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that over time, if we're damaging or degrading our non-human creation, that's going to impact human flourishing. And I think it's important that we realize climate change impacts every one of us. But the killer is that it doesn't affect us all equally. And that really is a core of the climate justice issue here, because it's often those who have the fewest resources to adapt to these changes or who are on the front lines of climate impacts, like those who are using the land directly to meet their basic needs or are living next to a coastline that might be facing inundation from sea level rise. Those communities, those people are often on the front lines of these impacts. And they're often traditionally least responsible for participating in creating the changes that we're experiencing. That's because most of the climate change we're experiencing today is a legacy impact from the greenhouse gases that were emitted many years ago. So while this trajectory is likely to continue without more targeted intervention, I think it also sets us up well for thinking about how we can both start here at home in our own choices, but then extending through relationship and partnership and support to those communities globally who might be even more acutely affected than we might be here in our own neighborhoods. And I think there's a really interesting second dimension to this, is that it's also going to affect young people more acutely. So thinking about my generation or future generations, they're the ones that are going to have to bear out the choices that we've been making historically and that we make today regarding the problem. So even though you mentioned I'm a senior advisor for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, I find it really interesting that there's not been a single month in my entire life where the average global temperature of the Earth has been cooler than normal, which means my entire experience of this world is a warming world. So if that's already been shaping my own understanding of the world, imagine what that's going to mean for our children and our grandchildren. So we have an opportunity to think about not only how we can help address critical needs now for local communities who are on the frontline impacts, but build out thinking so that we leave a better infrastructure for not only thinking about how to solve the problem and slow the change, but also leave opportunities for more solutions and options left on the table.
Anyone have anything to add? We did kind of cover this in the last question as well.
No, I think Rachel summed it up very well. You know, the thing is that one of the things that wealth affords us is the means to mitigate the direct impact on us. We've been having historical drought in Southern California, and yet I haven't gone thirsty once, right? I haven't even shortened the number of showers I take. But if you are collecting rainwater off your roof, there's no insulation, and it very quickly becomes an issue of survival.
So as a Christian, do we have a responsibility to focus on these earthly concerns? Or does it just fuel an urgency to pursue evangelism and other spiritual concerns? What should our focus be? This is a question that I have heard a lot over the years. And so I'm just really curious from this group, what do you think about that, weighing the earthly versus the spiritual, and what is our role here? Rusty, would you lead us?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Rachel raised the issue of generations having a different experience. And I have a different experience with generations with this question. I've never gotten this question from somebody under 30, but I've gotten it from people over 50 tons. It's like asking if it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. Like it is possible for Christians to care about more than one priority and to be really faithful in that. But I think we got to rethink what evangelism is in the current time. It's not just inviting people to be forgiven by God for their sins. Forgiveness is a gateway to become new humans. The Great Commission was to make disciples, not just to get people saved so they can go to heaven when they die. So we have to say something in our evangelism about what the life is that we're inviting people into. We could talk about the great commandment where God calls us to love him and to love others. Loving God seems to imply pretty obviously understanding and respecting his creation, being thankful, taking responsibility for it, and not ignoring it or dodging responsibility for it. And if we love people, whether it's here or abroad, it means taking seriously the environmental perils that they face, accepting our responsibility to help them adapt to climate chaos. It means doing our part to lessen the impact of our economy and lifestyles on their livelihoods. Maybe Scott Sabin should take a few fewer showers, although water use, that is a really local issue. It's not a global issue, but it affects people around the world, but Scott's showers don't actually affect any water balances in Malawi, just to get him off the hook there.
Thanks. And Nancy will appreciate that too.
Yeah, good. But
yeah, I'm grateful for the showers. Keep the showers.
I would just say evangelism is compromised when people don't see our lives reflecting the values that we find in scripture. So, I would say it's a kind of a bigger meta question of what is God saving people for? Like that should really come out in the way we talk about the gospel. In God's original plan, people are given the job of bearing his image, being stewards, having authority over a good creation. Then it says that in Genesis 3, that we invited chaos into that creation, and our ancestors gave up their vocation and they listened to the words of a serpent rather than God. But the good news is that God had a plan to bring about a renewed creation. He didn't set aside the role of humans when he did that. Instead, God uses a human, this man, Jesus, to defeat those chaotic forces. And it's like the powers that would have trapped us in violence, misery, selfishness, poverty, environmental chaos. Jesus called those powers down on himself and he destroyed their power on the cross. So his death sets us free, not just to go to heaven when we die, but so that we can participate with him in the reconciliation of all things, like it says in Colossians 1, including the way we steward the earth. He saves us and he gives us our original jobs back. Only this time we've got Jesus to show us what it really means to image God. So the good news is we can be right with God, right with others, and right with creation. This righteousness is a package deal. And God's purpose for us is that we should bear that image well. When I think about evangelism today, people actually don't want to have just a fire insurance policy. God puts it in our heart to want to have a purpose. And caring for creation is not like a sideshow or an optional extra to the gospel. So we need to really learn to tell that story, the big story of what God's doing in the world and how he wants to use renewed humans to heal his creation. And if we do that, I think it's going to supercharge our evangelism. I don't see that they're in conflict at all.
Well said, Rusty. The gospel is so much bigger than being all about me. And even the Great Commission, as it's given in Mark, is to preach the good news to all of creation, right? Now going from the sublime to the ridiculous, I've always kind of come up with a little bit of maybe a simplistic way of looking at this. But if God tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, what does that look like? Well, probably the closest I naturally come to modeling that is in my relationship with my children. And when I say, okay, the only thing that's important is the spiritual. We're gonna preach to them. We're gonna send them to vacation Bible school, but we're not gonna fix them dinner. We're not gonna feed them. Why do they go to that school to learn math and science and English? Because the only thing that really matters is their salvation. Well, that would be child abuse. If we're loving other neighbors as ourselves, why would we do that to them?
That's huge. Our next up question is what does the Bible say about the environment and climate change? This is another interesting question that comes up from time to time. Does the Bible say anything at all? And if so, what does it say? And as a Christian, what should our posture be towards environmental issues? Sandy, can you lead us on that one?
Sorry, failed to unmute. So yeah, sure. The Bible actually has an awful lot to say about environmental stewardship. And I have found over the years, as I've lectured and taught on this topic, that this comes as a big surprise to a lot of people, that the Bible is woke, and I'm intrigued by the fact that environmental concern has been overlooked for so long. So as I detail in the book that we're giving away today, the great blueprint for creation in Genesis 1 and 2 tells us that God set up this amazing planet and the cosmos itself with the intention that everything and everyone would be able to thrive in their appointed place and habitat. That's what the week of Genesis 1 is all about. And it tells us that the universe and all of its breathtaking majesty is an expression of God's good pleasure. It was good. And as we attend to the meaning behind that 7-day structure in Genesis 1, the perfect balance of this splendid and synergetic system is dependent on the sovereignty of the Creator. That's what day 7 communicates. God is enthroned over all. And humanity, created on day 6, was designated to serve as God's steward and vice regent. And then in Genesis 2:15, Adam and Eve are commanded to serve and protect this planet. So that's the blueprint. That's the intention. And all of redemptive history is about getting humanity back to that intention. So even with the fall, we find that whenever God's people show up in God's place, there are laws for creation care being communicated front and center. So as we look at Israel and their land grant, the territory of Canaan, we learn that the Israelites are commanded to practice sustainable agriculture. Yeah, did you learn that in Sunday school? Well, it's there. They are required to let their fields go fallow 1 out of 7 years as required by the constitution and bylaws of the nation that is Israel. That's the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, the exile of Israel is credited to the fact that the people did not give the land its Sabbath. So why does the land need a Sabbath? Well, any farmer will tell you that this is allowing your fields to lie fallow. It gives the land an opportunity to restore itself so that it can be fruitful for the next generation, and as fruitful for the next generation as it was for our generation. And Yahweh says, you're going to do this because the land is mine. And since it's mine, again, I want it as fertile for the next set of tenants as it was for you. And this is not some Pollyanna sort of ideal. This is actually the law of Israel. So as we move through the Old Testament, we find that the law codes in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, they command Israel to practice humane animal husbandry. That means taking care of domestic livestock, compassionate and humane slaughter. They're commanded to protect the wild creature so that she's able to reproduce and sustain her population. Environmental terrorism is actually forbidden in the book of Deuteronomy. And all of this is in a law code that dates as early as 1200 BC. So way earlier than contemporary thought processes. When we get to the New Testament, we learn that Paul, first century rabbi, who I'm going to guess did not have a single tie-dye t-shirt in his closet. Paul speaks of how the earth is suffering right along with fallen humanity. In other words, it wasn't just humanity that suffered the effects of the fall. This is a lot of what Rusty and Scott were referring to with the last question. In Romans 8, Paul says that the earth was subjected to futility, literally frustration, because of what we, humanity, chose. So the earth is, quote, anxiously longing for the revealing of the sons of God. And the revealing of the sons of God is the final resurrection of our bodies on the last day. So for those who think that the only goal of the gospel is saving souls, note that Paul, the great apostle, is putting the resurrection of the earth and the resurrection of the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve right there in juxtaposition. He says, for the creation was subjected to futility, frustration, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it in hope. That the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So what Paul is doing is he's talking about the great arc of redemptive history and how this arc is leading us back to Eden, back to the restoration of God's perfect plan at the beginning. You can see all over your Bibles this great arc being detailed, but perhaps it's most clearly described when we get to the end of the book, Revelation 21 and 22. And what we find here is what we as Christians, as evangelicals call heaven, is actually a resurrected earth. My husband's a theologian. He says this is the best kept secret in Christian theology. So what do we read? Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. This is John. How does he describe it? He describes this new heaven and new earth with a tree of life and a cosmic river that waters the whole world. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that's Eden. In other words, heaven is not some disembodied space where we float around like fat babies playing harps. Heaven is Eden restored. And as Greg Beale, New Testament scholar, one of my past professors, states that the earth, like us, will be raised, quote, as an identifiable counterpart to the old cosmos and a renewal of it, just as the body will be raised without losing its former identity. So Paul, our first century rabbi, again, no tie-dye t-shirts anywhere, he dares to associate the final destiny of this planet with the ultimate expression of the believer's identity as the redeemed heirs of God. That's a big deal. So our Bibles talk about this a lot.
So our Bibles are talking about this a lot. I mean, you just gave us a very clear and robust theology there. So why has the church struggled with the question of environmental stewardship?
Yes, very good question. Why has the church, the historic moral compass of our society, gotten so lost on this topic? Yeah, I've been lecturing, writing on this for more than a decade, and it doesn't matter where I go, Californians to Kentuckians, Floridians to Minnesotans, there's a great deal of confusion on this. Even though our neighbors, both locally and globally, obviously care about this deeply, it's a relevant topic, but the church seems to be paralyzed as regards environmental concerns. So what's the deal? What I talk about in the introduction of my book is what I think the three core issues are. And the first one is not going to surprise anyone. It's politics, and not kingdom politics, but American politics. This isn't even global politics necessarily. This is a bit unique to the American system. I think that most of us would agree that the traditional political allies of the church are not the traditional political allies of environmental concern. If you are pro-life, it is assumed that you cannot also be pro-environment, which everyone on this panel is like, what? If you are a patriot, you supposedly cannot be a conservationist. Or to be more forthright, in the United States, if you are an environmentalist, you must be a Democrat, and Democrats supposedly are not pro-life, hence the conflict. So what's happened is that environmental advocacy has been pigeonholed into a particular political profile, and it's become guilty by association. So that's one. Two, I think that the issue is largely similar to the church's problem with most issues of social concern. And that is that we, the Western majority voice, are largely sheltered from the impact of environmental degradation on the global community. This is Scott in his showers, right? We don't see how unregulated use of land and water by big business decimates the lives of the marginalized. We have not witnessed the sterilization of the fertile fields of Punjab, India, because of industrial agriculture. We haven't seen the social collapse that it's caused. We've not stood on the shores of the Ganges and seen the results of the unrelenting abuse of this estuary. via untreated chemical waste and raw sewage, etc. My front windows do not look out over the lunar landscapes left behind by mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia. I don't see the ragged remains of Madagascar's 88% deforestation. I think it's up to 90% now. All of these things leave the marginalized without recourse. That's what Plant with Purpose does, is addresses these issues. But we, the Western American church, because we don't see these things, we struggle to understand creation care as an expression of concern for the widow and the orphan. And the third thing I addressed in my last response, and perhaps the most detrimental, is that there are too many out there that teach this idea that the created order is bound only for destruction. As a result, there are many devoted followers of Jesus who have come to believe that it is ethically appropriate to use the earth's resources as aggressively as possible to accomplish what really matters, the conversion of souls. And the end result is that the church, particularly our evangelical wing of the church, has inadvertently dismissed the issue of environmental stewardship as peripheral or even alien to the concerns of the Bible. And I argue loud and clear, no, that is not the posture, not only of the Bible, but of the God who stands behind the Bible. We have been designed as stewards. Our commission is to love what God loves. And I think I can prove in spades that God loves this majestic ecosphere that he's created for his people.
Hey, could I jump in there to follow on and say amen to everything that Sandy said? You know, it's interesting that it's a question that really applies to Western and particularly American churches. It's interesting that churches in poor countries whose people are farmers are much more accepting of the notion of environmental stewardship, that their vocation as farmers has dignity. They're not just the despised and wretched of the earth, but God is calling them to care for their land. They like see that, they get that theologically as well as practically. So they're a lot more accepting of climate science because they see the way their farming practices are disrupted. Tier Fund's a poverty alleviation organization like Plant with Purpose. And for 30 years, we've had this focus on creation care and climate change since 1992, because brothers and sisters in the developing world are asking us to use our voices because they hear messages coming from the global north that say, we don't care, we're not going to do anything about it, or we're going to take care of ourselves and you guys are on your own. And they're asking us to use our voices within the church to get the church to have a global voice on climate change. And those global churches, oh, go ahead, Sandy.
I was just going to throw in there, it's not just a global concern. Our farmers in the United States of America are in crisis. Family farms are disappearing at an extinction rate ratio that should terrify us. Our stewards of the soil are being left without recourse as well. And the voices in Appalachia who are dealing with the abuse of, again, big industry coal mining, our problem is that we don't listen to those at the bottom of the food chain. And we're the church. How is it we're not listening?
Thinking about listening, one of the things that I hear a lot is people saying, well, we're thinking about this, and not fully understanding that there is a global conversation happening around these topics. So what are Christians around the world doing? Scott, would you lead us in that one?
Yeah, well, I'll start out. I think that, Rusty already mentioned his organization, Tier Fund, has been a leader in this area. And certainly the churches in Europe and in the Catholic Church and the Vatican have been much more proactive on this than we have. But my firsthand knowledge is a lot of the churches that we partner with in East Africa and in the Caribbean that are already talking about this, that have been talking about this. And Rusty touched on this a little bit, but for subsistence farmers who've been disempowered and basically told by every possible measurement that what they're doing is worth nothing. You know, the global economy pays them nothing. Their own governments tell them that they're backwards and they're not contributing. To realize that they have an opportunity to participate in God's redemptive work as that's life-changing. And more churches are talking about that. We've seen the Lutheran Church in Tanzania, for example, get behind tree planting in a big way. And I still remember one of their pastors coming up to me. I showed a picture of the so-called community managed forest, the buffer zone around Kilimanjaro National Park, and it was stumps as far as you could see. And he came up to me afterwards and said, that was so convicting, because that's what God has given to us. And the church, you know, the church has tree nurseries, and students who are going for confirmation have to plant trees as a part of their confirmation process. And anyway, just it's often a disconnect, because some of the feedback that we get from pastors in the Dominican Republic, for example, is, look, we can't wait till you tell your American supporters what we're doing to restore God's creation. And well, that's actually not going to play that well. It's a sad thing to have. But anyway, I think that there's a real opportunity globally for Christians to be in the leadership in this area, and certainly an opportunity for us to have a better voice.
I'd love to add to that I believe that environmental missions is the next big move for the church in world evangelism. 100 years ago, our people packed up their lives and headed off to faraway shores to build hospitals and orphanages and schools in the name of Jesus, and brought the gospel, partnered with a real need of the communities that they were reaching across the planet. I think this century, our missionaries are going to be packing up their lives and heading to places like Haiti and Madagascar to teach the locals how to defend their estuaries, plant indigenous species, hang on to their soil, and live sustainably. And Rusty and Scott have got dozens and dozens of those stories. And I'm supporting half a dozen of those myself. I think this is a great window of opportunity for missions.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that we're thinking about is, why are we talking about this today? It sounds like a lot of the things we've been talking about have been going on for a really long time. So why are we here today? Today we're here because the UN has launched this decade of ecosystem restoration. That's what initiated this conversation. Last week was World Environment Day. We're definitely seeing this global movement of secular agencies trying to raise awareness of these issues, and that's what we're responding to in this exact moment. Do we see any conflict between our faith and aligning ourselves with these global initiatives being led by the UN, our local governments, our federal government, or secular agencies? Maybe Rusty, would you start us off there?
Yeah, there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction against government from some parts of the church, and there's probably an over-reliance on government as the solution to everything wrong in the world from other folks on the other side of the political spectrum. But I think we have to recognize it's always a mixed bag. We don't live in a theocracy. We don't get to call the shots when it comes to public policy. We're less like David in Israel than more like Daniel in Babylon, who exercised wisdom and prudence in knowing how to cooperate with the government and when to resist the government and resist unjust laws. So I think we can cooperate for the common good with institutions like the government when they are aligned with our Christian ideals about how to care for the common good. That's what Francis Schaeffer called being co-belligerents. You're fighting a common enemy or a common evil like poverty and injustice. So as far as the UN it's probably gets a little too much credit for its capacity to take over our lives It's not the most efficient or well-run organization in the world, but it is a forum for nations to cooperate, to talk about the common good and to oppose human rights abuses. And one thing that I think we really have to remember about this whole notion of human rights, which animates the secular conversation about these issues, is that those organizations stole that idea from the church, and we stole it from the Bible. This was completely part of the church's influence on society, that we even are talking about human rights. You know, our Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Nothing is less self-evident in the history of the earth than that all people are created equal. It was the teaching of the church, being salt and light through the influence of society, that taught us that everyone is made in the image of God. Everyone has equal worth. It was early Christians who ended the practice of exposing children to leaving them on dump piles, treating women like just flawed versions of men, using children, women, and slaves to satisfy the sexual needs and desires of men who are the dominant forces in society. Ancient Romans were just disgusted at the way Christians cared for the abused, for the poor, for the sick, for the elderly. It did not fit their notion of how the world should work, but the gospel turned it upside down. So the only reason organizations like the UN are talking about human rights is because of the influence of the gospel in the world. And we ought to claim credit for that. And we ought to live into that and not look at where they might deviate now from Christian theology here and there. I mean, we can serve as an influence on that, but what we can really claim is the giant victory that the world is a completely different place because of the gospel. You know, this conversation about human rights is untethered from Christian theology now, and it's an open question of how long it can maintain its salience and still have an impact. But for now, we've really won that battle, and let's go ahead and live into that.
So kind of staying on that theme, but also thinking a little bit more practically, as Christians, what are some ways that we can respond to this current ecosystem crisis and the environment, individually, locally in our own communities, and globally, if we're doing this in alignment with governments or not? What does that look like? Rachel, would you jump in on that one?
Sure. Yeah. And one thought, echoing some of what Rusty was saying, you know, none of those so-called secular organizations are theocentric. So they're not God-centered. We shouldn't expect them to be that way. But if we consider adopting theocentric pragmatism, which is what ethicist Willis Jenkins calls it, but it means if we think about bringing the best of our resources, the best of our traditions to the table, to a shared common problem, we actually can identify some common ground and build trust that is actually required for actually moving this work forward at that stage. So that actually suggests to me that we actually need Christians and we need the church actively engaged in these conversations, because to be honest, we're not seen. We're not the first group of people that people think of when they think, I need to get people who can really move the world on climate and environmental justice. Unfortunately, often they're not thinking about the church as one of those agents, even though, as everything we've just talked about here, Christians have tremendous resources, theological, spiritual, and otherwise, to bring to the conversation. So there's so much that we can do, which is segueing to your next question, that I think we have to ask ourselves, okay, where can we start and how can we plug in? So first of all, every single organization that's represented here is already beautifully and intentionally engaged at this intersection. So Arasha and Tear Fund and Plant with Purpose, and YCA, engaging young people around advocacy, all of these groups are already doing great work on the ground. So first of all, get to know what they're doing. What is their mission of their work? Amplify that, see how you can support it. Learn the stories of the people that are being impacted, and then share those stories with other people. I think that's one, we don't always get to go travel to be on the ground and meet others who are experiencing these frontline impacts, but we can hear those stories, and we have a responsibility to listen and learn. And that is in itself an act of love, but it's also a precursor to acting in love through other actions that we might take. So, making it personal is a really important, helpful step. So I think that's understanding our own story as part of this larger story of global environmental change. It's easy to think it's happening out there, it doesn't affect me, which we've talked about, but the fact is none of us are exempt. So we can understand our role in it. So then we realize we have a lot of agency and freedom then to act on those choices that we do have. And I actually think that speaks really well to the idea that the Lord has called us to be obedient, and he's given so many opportunities to be faithful. So we can express love and joy and hope in not only our daily choices, but how we act in the context of community. So of course, one way to look at this individually is to think of an entire checklist worth of things that if you go through the checklist, then somehow you've made it, you're a good steward. I don't champion a checklist of things, but I do think there's more things than you might realize that you do have direct influence and control over that can impact things at larger scales. When I think about the sources of energy and how I use it, what I use for transportation, the food that I eat and consume, actually what I plant in my backyard, and how even we might choose to engage in advocacy. All of those are actually tools that are within my sphere of influence. And so one encouragement at that level is to identify one thing that you want to learn more about or you can act upon within your own sphere of influence. That might be a little different for me today than it might be for you, but you can identify something. And the reason why you're doing it matters. So we've already been talking about all of the beautiful reasons why Christians can and should engage in this work. And I think that should fuel us. But it's also important that we're acting in the context of community. So one thing that I think can be hard, at least in my personal experience, but really rewarding, is having more conversations in your local church about why this matters. Sitting and talking to the people in the pew next to me, or maybe still virtually for many of us, engaging and asking, what is it like for our church to actually act on these values that we say matter to us? Or should matter to us? What does it mean to do this in my local places and my local spaces? And it might actually mean that you already have some existing programs or threads, or maybe you have a missions program like we're just talking about, and that you could expand the notion of how you think about mission. So sometimes it's just connecting this within the existing framework that you have, and then finding ways that you can act together in community. And that is actually a really great way to bear witness to the gospel to others around you, because they're going to start to see that you also are caring for the space that you've been given. And then I also just want to plug the fact that I think it's really important to encourage and support the members of within your Christian community, whether that's a local church or with other organizations that you partner with, whose full-time Christian vocation is to do this work. I know that sometimes, some people think, oh, well, if you're engaged in Christian mission, then you're going to be a doctor, or you're going to be a teacher, or there's some list of things that, those are Christian vocations, and they can be used to advance the Lord's kingdom. So can full-time vocational work in this arena. And I think we need more Christians who are engaged in this work, and we should endeavor to support them and encourage them, recognizing that if this is part of God's mission, then it ought to be part of the mission of God's people. And so just plugging that, I think that's also helpful, even within the sphere of influence that you have, to identify a couple things you can do and support the groups like we mentioned here. You can also encourage and nurture and support those whose full-time vocation is this work as well.
Thank you.
Just a quick addition there, Christy. The final section of my book, Stewards, is an appendix entitled Resources for the Responsive Christian, which gives folks a list of things that they can do in their own sphere of influence, as Rachel is speaking of. And the number one, the first thing is get informed. And a way you can get informed is by becoming a card-carrying member of Plant with Purpose, or Young Evangelicals for Environmental, I got the title wrong there, or Tier Fund, or whatever, or Sierra Club, or Audubon. There's 1,000 things that we can be doing.
I want to jump in really quick, because I think something important was something that my friend Rusty Prichard once taught me. And that is that we start from a place of joy. Creation care should be fun. I'm editorializing a little bit here, but we don't want to become environmental Pharisees, moving from a place of guilt, but rather from a place of joy. And so Rusty's advice was start by putting up a bird feeder. And I love that. Anyway, it starts small, but anything we do for God starts small. I mean, 5 loaves and 2 fish, that's where we are.
So what's our reason for hope here? We've heard some bleak things. We've heard some exciting things. Where is hope in this?
Well, ultimately, our hope is in Jesus Christ. I mean, that's our ultimate hope. And I think that that's an important thing we have to share in a place where it's very easy to get bleak. It's very easy to get bleak. At a micro level, and I'm really excited, we're talking about the UN decade for ecosystem restoration. You know, for a long time, we've talked primarily about conservation and preservation and mitigation, but here we're actually talking about restoration. And I think one of the things that's given me hope is seeing watersheds restored, to see places that were eroded and dry and dusty become green and verdant, and rivers that had dried up and streams that had dried up start to flow again and become year round. And we've seen that. I've seen that micro level, you know, 5 loaves and 2 fish, but that gives me hope.
Hey, can I jump in to say that I totally agree with the 5 loaves and 2 fish analogy, and the fact that you can see where Plant with Purpose works from space using satellite imagery means that things do tend to add up, and they tend to spiral as God gets involved and adds his blessing to what we're doing. Even the smallest actions can be magnified, and we can't forget about that. You know, I think we forget that this is spiritual warfare, and I don't want to sound like spooky or this present darkness or anything like that, but I mean, Satan is a saboteur, and he wants to screw up God's creation, and his victory is when he uses us to do it. That's a total compromise of what God created us and our relationship with creation to be like. But God has defeated that power. The only way he's able to do it now is when he plays mind games with us and gets us to believe a lie that somehow our flourishing depends on beating down creation and not caring for it. Jesus, on the other hand, wants to restore creation, and he wants to use us to do it. So I know that Jesus won, so that gives me a lot of hope.
I would just throw on there that I think hope is a very real issue. Most folks who have spent their lives as advocates in this field often deal with soul-crushing despair on a regular basis. But I think if Paul were among us, he would remind us that we must be encouraged. Because even though our efforts, like the cosmos, have been subjected to frustration, and I'm quoting Paul here, know that they've been subjected in hope. And the hope is a plan that can't fail. And the hope is a God who stands behind and before his people, and a God who stands as our advocate, advancing and empowering our efforts. So back to that loaves and fishes metaphor, we might not have much, but honestly, we don't have much generally now, do we? Right? Not many among you who are wise or noble, but God empowers our efforts. And I often wind up speaking about moving into environmental concern like I talk about any other issue of sanctification. You don't start at the finish line. You start at the beginning with small steps that move the right direction. And this is a matter about conforming our character to the character of our God. And if God has entrusted us with stewardship, we need to start embracing stewardship, one small step, joyful small step at a time.
We are wrapping up. I'm going to let all the respondents give any last thoughts, or did we miss anything? I tried to run through some of these questions, so sorry about that. But I see that people are starting to use the Q&A feature for questions. Please send those there. We may go a little bit long to answer some of those questions, but we'll do our best. So any last thoughts from panelists as those questions come in?
Christy, I have a quote I love to share. I was doing a podcast with David Capes down in the Linear Library in Houston, Texas. Hello, anyone from Texas today. He opened the podcast asking me, so Sandy Richter, what's your big idea? And my answer was, my big idea is to awaken the sleeping giant and to fill her with a terrible resolve. And I think the sleeping giant is the evangelical wing of the church. We know how to make things happen. We just need to know that it's our commission. So here's the quote. This one is coming from Gus Speth, chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality under President Jimmy Carter and a dozen other environmental organizations, a real insider and not a card-carrying evangelical by any stretch. And this is what he said at his retirement. I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And here it is, Gus Speth, and we scientists don't know how to do that. So let me say that we leaders of the church, we know how to do that. We lay people sitting in our pew, we know how to do that. So my heart responds to Dr. Speth with a put me in, coach. This is what we do. So let's get about doing it.
Thank you. Some questions that have poured in, feel free to dive in if you've got other thoughts, panelists. But one of the questions that came is tree planting really making a difference? I heard that trees get cut down about as fast as they are planted. If they aren't native trees, can they do more harm than good? We get a lot of these questions actually at Plant with Purpose, so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I kind of want to pitch that back to you, but you know, the tree planting, obviously we've been involved in tree planting for 35 years, planted now over 40 million trees. I'm always hesitant though, when people see it as a silver bullet. This is going to be how we solve the problem. Tree planting. If it's done wrong, if we try and do it as a cookie cutter operation, it all falls apart. And for us, one of the most important things was realizing that the people we work with are our partners in this. They're not our projects. And if they have ownership of the trees, including the right to use their products, those trees aren't going to be cut down right away. And they will plant what's appropriate. They will plant what they need, and they will plant what will grow in that ecosystem.
Yeah, if I could jump in and wear my scientist hat for a minute. I love this question because I always think it's helpful to realize that tree planting should be thought of as additional to forest conservation and management. So if you're thinking about it on a carbon cycle perspective, if you're cutting down the mature trees that are already storing a lot of carbon and you cut that mature forest down, to make up that amount of carbon is going to take quite a long time. It can't happen instantaneously. So it's better to think of protect the trees that we have and then think about strategically how we might begin, restoring them where they were previously lost, or some cases maybe putting them in ecologically appropriate locations where they maybe haven't been for a long time. And the thing is, as I mentioned at the opening, I think tree planting can provide enormous benefits if done, as Scott mentioned, strategically. So the species matter, the method matters, the ownership and engagement of local communities and indigenous communities matters. So those all have to be in play, but it can be one tool, important tool, but one tool in thinking about how to fight climate change and also how to be more resilient. So intact, healthy ecosystems actually help us navigate a lot of other larger global environmental changes. So I think it's really, just to echo what's been said, I think it's really great that there is a renewed focus on ecosystem restoration, and we'll just have to make sure that that it's done well and doesn't have maladaptive or perverse impacts. So, but I generally am really excited about it. So thinking about tree planting as additional to forest conservation and management, and as only one tool in our toolbox, but an important tool, I think is helpful.
I find often that tree planting is easy to talk about. And when you're talking to people who are talking about tree planting as one of the main tools that we have available to us to actually mitigate climate change, usually that's coming from people who understand the complexity and understand ecosystem work and understand how tree planting can affect marginalized communities positively or negatively. But instead of having space for an entire paragraph or a book answer, they just say we need to get a trillion trees in the ground or something like that, because it's quick and easy. But what's exciting there is some simplicity. If we all just do one little bit, do one small thing, and we do that one small thing as a global community, we can make a major change, and that is powerful. Sorry, I just broke the moderator and answered a question there myself. One of the things that I want to remind everybody of is that we will be reaching out to 24 of the people who attended today. This is our little gift that we had with a mini Christian environmental library. So check your email. That's how we're going to communicate with you. That seems to be the way that's best. Check your email for a follow-up from us. We will be sending out some books from some of the speakers here today, and we'd love to get those in your hands. So thank you again for coming. We're still taking questions, but it's 2 o'clock, so if you need to sneak out, I just wanted to make sure that you heard that message and know where to look for information on if you are one of those 24 lucky winners of our special giveaway. Another question that's come to us is, if these huge global issues, I mean, they're just so big, how does working with poor farmers in faraway places really make a difference? I mean, on purpose, why are you here, I guess is the question. And Tier Fund as well. These are giant things. Why does it matter to work with really poor farmers far away?
Rusty, you want to start?
Well, something I learned from Scott is to recognize that most of the poorest people that are the hardest to reach, that are the least connected to markets, that have the poorest prospects for flourishing in the world materially, are poor farmers living in really marginal environments. And that's why Plant with Purpose exists. I'll let Scott tell the story, but it really does make you realize there's a syndrome of problems that affect people that are on the very margins. And Jesus calls us to care for those that are on the very margins. He didn't say, well, think about who you're going to help in terms of how much greenhouse gas pollution you can prevent. He said, care for the least of these because it's me, not because it's like it's me or because it's almost as if it's serving me. He said, that is serving me when you're doing that. So when we serve those folks, we are really serving Jesus, and we're in solidarity with those that are on the edges of society. And as Scott has already alluded to, and others have, it adds up. We don't have to doubt that our God is a God who takes what's little and makes it big. But we don't have to start with some sort of consequentialist ethic to evaluate who we should serve. We're going to the right people if we're serving poor farmers in faraway places.
This is an interesting paradox. Sorry to jump in there, Scott.
Go ahead.
That paradox, and Rachel was really speaking to this earlier as well. We have a global ecological crisis, environmental crisis. We have scientists and massive organizations that are attempting to address this. And then we have the church and our Christian calling. And what makes us unique is exactly what Rusty has just spoken. What makes us unique is that our calling is to the least of these. What makes us unique is we know that we have the sovereign of the universe empowering our efforts. And so if you look at the gospel plan just from its onset, Jesus started with 11 rednecks, uneducated rednecks in northern Galilee, and he put the kingdom on their shoulders and he said, go for it. And world history has been transformed forever. So apparently reaching out to the least of these is part of that crazy strategy of the kingdom. So sorry, Scott, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, if there's one thing we've learned from all of this, ecologically, is it's all connected. I mean, working with poor farmers overseas impacts us. That's not why we do it, but it's connected, and that's probably the overwhelming lesson of the global environmental crisis, is that it's all connected, whether it's what we do here impacting them or what they do there impacting us.
Yeah, and I just to jump in again, and I learned this again from Scott Sabin, is that everybody should have the opportunity to participate in this project of restoring and reconciling all things in the name of Jesus, because we are images of God. And that's not just white saviors philanthropically directing donations to plant trees somewhere. It's every single person who lives on that landscape that can play a part and understand their role in the mission of God. And that's got to animate us in a completely different way. And it's really worthwhile.
I'll throw in one more thing as well. It takes me back to several meetings I've had in the past. Okay, I want to say this so it doesn't sound discouraging, it sounds empowering. When it comes to the kingdom mission on this planet, if we're talking about this from the perspective of Christian theology, the church is not going to succeed in ending every war. We are not going to succeed in giving a home to every orphan or rescuing every young woman from sex trafficking. We're not going to succeed. We know that. But that does not give us a pass at standing boldly with the opposition. So what does it say about my commitment to the God who has rescued me if I'm not willing to stand with his agenda, even if I know I'm going to lose?
Well said.
Wow. We probably have space for just one more question, and then we should wrap. Just scanning through the questions. Kind of following on that, a question that came in is, where are Christians reshaping and truly setting new examples of how then should we live in light of the global ecological crisis? Did I say that one very well? I was reading and talking at the same time, but where is it that Christians are shaping and truly setting new examples of how then should we live in light of what we've been talking about?
I'm sure everybody has their own example. I was blessed to spend an hour and a half on the phone this morning with our director in Congo, and in the heart of one of the most challenging places in the world, people who often don't eat 2 meals a day have planted nearly 1 million trees in the last year, and they are excited because they have purpose now in participating in God's redemptive work and restoring God's creation. I mean, it's been, I alluded to this earlier, but it's been transformational as they've discovered that God has given them talents and given them purpose and vocation, and their farming is not just the dead end worst thing you can do. I learned recently that apparently in Rwanda, if you want to threaten somebody, you say, I'm going to send you back to the farm. That's kind of how farming has been regarded. These are people who've discovered that farming is actually a vocation given to them by God for the benefit of all of us. Anyway, all right.
I love to tell the story of Neil and Danielle Karlstrom, who I support, and they are a young missionary couple who headed to Madagascar about 6 or 8 years ago. I've already mentioned Madagascar, 88, 90% deforested, this incredible paradise of one of the most unique biospheres out there. Neil went as a botanist, Danielle went as a midwife. And in Madagascar, 1 out of every 10 women die in childbirth, largely due to malnutrition. So in the name of Jesus, they brought their sweet little babies and set up shop, teaching the locals how to plant indigenous trees in their backyard gardens. Those trees get sold to the UN so that they're able to support themselves. They're restoring estuaries. And Danielle is walking the Malagasy people in her town through childbirth and keeping them and their babies alive. If this isn't the work of Jesus, I don't know what is.
Well, I was inspired really recently by a story that I heard from the Arasha family. So Arasha is a Christian conservation organization, and it does engage in restoration work, but there's also a place for advocacy around protection and conservation. So we don't always have to restore what's degraded, but can actually also keep protecting what we have. And actually, the Ghana's Ateba forest was under threat from what they thought was basically a foregone conclusion of mining, new mining operation. And there was significant political pressure, and yet Arasha Ghana was actually at the forefront of working with other local organizations to actually lead the advocacy network to actually help explain what would be lost by the deforestation and destruction of this area, and also including, again, the benefits to local peoples who are using this forest as well. And what was so notable about that is that it was an example where Christians were actually out in front leading the discussion, and actually it resulted in a lot of pressure, and they protected the forest, and they didn't go ahead and put the mining operation in, which is incredible to me. Arasha is the only faith-based organization in the Union for Conservation of Nature Protection. That's incredible to me that they're able to bear witness to that. And it's because they're motivated and driven by all of the many things that we were just talking about. And that they were an example out in front. So that's an example of how advocacy can also help change outcomes as well.
If you want to get inspired, go to the Arasha webpage and look at the number of different projects that they're involved in. Really cool stuff. I mean, the example that Rachel just gave, but there's dozens of other projects.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for taking a little extra time. Just a reminder as we close, check your email for 2 great reasons. The first is 24 of you webinar participants have been randomly selected to win that free mini environmental library, which features copies of Stewards of Eden by Sandy Richter and Tending to Eden by Scott Sabin. We can probably send out some more really great titles as well. Those are 2 good books to start with, though. And second, we'll be sending out a link to the recording of the webinar so that you can keep it or share it with family, friends, social media, however you see fit. I know that there are people who registered but were unable to make this exact time slot. They'll get a copy of this as well. And thank you again to all of you for joining us, and to Rachel, Scott, Rusty, and Sandy for being willing to answer the questions that we're throwing your way and speaking with such eloquence on this topic. Just as we go, I want to leave you with a quote from another one of our friends, Catherine Hayhoe, who happens to be a very public and well-spoken Christian. She says that perhaps the most important thing that we can do about climate change is to talk about it. And so that's what we're trying to do here today, but that's also what we want to send you out to do a little bit more effectively, hopefully, in your communities where you come from. So just by entering into this conversation today, no matter where you stand on any of these issues, that you're making a difference and you're moving our community towards action. So keep the conversation going, and thank you.